The life of St. Aldhelm, Bishop of Sherborne. Our Holy Father Aldhelm was born in about 639. His father was called Kenter and was from the royal family of Wessex in southern England. When he was still a boy, his father sent him to be trained in Greek and Latin letters at the monastery of St. Augustine in Canterbury. Some years later, Aldhelm returned to his native Wessex, and when he was about 22, received the monastic tonsure in the monastery of Malmesbury, which had been founded by the Irishman Maildub in about 635. At some point, he was ordained to the priesthood by Bishop Eleutherius of Wessex. In 671, Aldhelm returned to Canterbury to study in the famous school of St. Adrian, who was described by St. Bede as very learned in the scriptures, experienced in ecclesiastical and monastic administration, and a great scholar in Greek and Latin. Here, in addition to the Holy Scriptures, ecclesiastical subjects, and Greek, Latin, and Hebrew, he studied Roman law, music, arithmetic, and 100 different kinds of poetic meter. Soon, he acquired a high reputation as a writer of both prose and poetry. Bede praised his works, and 200 years later, Saint King Alfred considered his poetry, which was still being sung, as superior to all other English poetry. There is a story that he used to attract believers to his church in Frome by singing songs to hard accompaniment on the bridge over which they passed. First, he would sing popular ballads, and then, when he had caught the people's attention, he would introduce words of a more serious nature. Aldhelm was forced to return home from Canterbury because of illness, and in 675 was elected Abbot of Malmesbury on the death of Maildub. One of his first achievements was to replace the wooden church built by Maildub by a splendid stone one dedicated to the apostles Peter and Paul. The verses he composed to celebrate the consecration are still extant. He also built 2 more churches in Malmesbury dedicated to the Mother of God and the Archangel Michael. The latter was still standing in the 12th century, and William of Malmesbury described it as excelling in size and beauty any other ancient church in England. The Mercian and West Saxon kings and nobles gave many endowments to Aldhelm. This enabled him to build daughter monasteries and churches at Bradford-on-Avon, dedicated to St. Lawrence, at Frome, to St. John the Baptist, at Wareham, to St. Martin, at Bruton, to St. Peter, at Abingdon, Sherborne, Langton Matravers, and Corfe. He also persuaded King Einar of Wessex to refound the monastery at Glastonbury. St. Aldhelm lived a life of great asceticism in his monastery, struggling in prayer, fasting, and reading. Like several of the Celtic saints, he used to read the whole of the Psalter at night, standing in a pool, which afterwards came to be called by his name. At the same time, he continued his educational and literary activity, and his treatise on virginity, which he presented to St. Hildelicia, Abbess of Barking, is still extant. He was also renowned for the grace of wonder-working. Once, during the building of the Church of St. Mary in Malmesbury, the workers noticed that one of the beams which had been transported a long distance for integration into the structure was too short. This was a blow, because it would have been a great labor and expense to bring another beam of the right size to the site. Aldhelm, however, nothing daunted, succeeded in lengthening the beam to the required size by his prayers alone. It is said that during 2 fires that destroyed the whole monastery during the reigns of Kings Alfred and Edward, this beam suffered no damage, but finally perished through age and dry rot. St. Aldhelm decided to go to Rome to obtain privileges for his monasteries from the Pope. On the way, he stopped at his estate in Dorset and built a church in Wareham. William of Malmesbury relates of this church that in the 12th century it was roofless, but that the shepherds of the district would crowd into it during storms because they believed that it never let in the rain. The spirit of Aldhelm watched over it, they claimed, and all attempts to re-roof it by nobles of the province failed. and even more miracles took place through his intercession at this church in Wareham than at his monastery in Malmesbury, where his relics lay. St. Aldhelm arrived in Rome and was housed in the Lateran Palace by Pope Sergius I. Every day he would celebrate the Divine Liturgy, and one day, having celebrated the liturgy and being still with his thoughts caught up to heaven, he cast his chasuble behind him. The acolyte who was serving him was occupied in another part of the altar and did not catch it, but the chasuble remained miraculously suspended in thin air, hanging as it were on a sunbeam that was passing through the stained window. This chasuble was brought back to England, and in the 12th century still remained with no trace of corruption in the monastery of Malmesbury. While Aldhelm was still in Rome, a boy was born in the house of the Pope's chamberlain. It was rumored that the mother was a nun and was concealing the identity of the father. Soon the Pope was being accused of having fathered the child, and the scandal reached such proportions that it reached the ears of Emperor Justinian II in Constantinople, and an ecclesiastical trial was initiated. But at this moment, Aldhelm came to the defense of the Pope. What would they say in Britain, he said, or in some other country, if it was known that the Roman pontiff was being thus assailed by his own citizens? Then he ordered the child to be brought, so that he could dispel the slander with his own mouth. But the people derided him. How could a 9-days-old child, who had not yet been baptized, tell the truth about his parentage? Nevertheless, by the power of God, the child spoke up in a completely clear voice and declared that Pope Sergius was a virgin. The Pope was triumphantly vindicated, and Aldhelm praised. The saint was then asked whether he could reveal the identity of the true father, but he refused, saying that if he could, he would rescue the innocent, but he would not condemn the guilty to death. By a bull dated about 701, which is still in existence, Pope Sergius granted Aldhelm's monasteries at Malmesbury and form exemption from episcopal jurisdiction. No priest, whatever his status, was allowed to celebrate the liturgy in the monastic churches without the permission of the abbot, and when the abbot died, the monks were to elect his successor. This charter was later confirmed by Kings Ina of Wessex and Ethelred of Mercia, both kings agreeing that in the event of war between their kingdoms, the monasteries would be left in peace. St. Aldhelm returned home loaded with holy relics and a wonderful altar made of the finest white marble. It is said that a camel was carrying it as far as the Alps, but the animal slipped and was crushed by the altar, which itself broke into 2 pieces. The saint made the sign of the cross, and lo, both the camel and the altar were immediately restored. On his return, Aldhelm gave the altar to King Ina, who placed it in the Church of St. Mary at Bruton. In the 12th century, the crooked flaw in the marble of the altar was still visible as a witness to the miracle. A great crowd greeted the saint as he disembarked in England. There was general rejoicing that the light of Britain had returned, and on the repose of St. Hedda of Winchester in 705, the diocese was divided into 2, and Aldhelm was elected bishop of the western half, with his see at Sherborne. The saint at first refused, saying that he was too old and wanted to end his days quietly at Malmesbury. But the council replied that with his age came greater maturity and freedom from vice. So the saint finally yielded and went to Canterbury for his consecration at the hands of Archbishop Bertwald. While in the east of the country, he made a trip to Dover, where ships came in from the continent laden with all kinds of merchandise. Finding a complete copy of the Old and New Testaments, he offered a price for it to the sailors, but they rejected his offer, jeered at him, and set out to sea. But a storm immediately arose, and finding themselves in danger, stretched out their hands to the man of God on the shore. He prayed, and the storm immediately abated, the wind turned, and the sailors returned to shore. In gratitude, they offered him the manuscripts for free, but he insisted on giving them a fair price. The manuscripts were still to be seen in Malmesbury in the 12th century. At about this time, the Britons of Cornwall became tributaries of King Einar of Wessex, and a council was convened by the king to determine how best to unite the churches of the Saxons and the Britons, which were divided by a dispute over the true date of Pascha. Aldhelm was appointed to write a letter to King Geraint of Cornwall on the subject, which is still extant. He was successful, and the Britons of Cornwall adopted the Roman Byzantine Paschalion. The Britons of Wales were converted some years later. Also at this time, Aldhelm wrote a letter to the monks of Wilfrid, the exiled Bishop of York and Hexham, exhorting them to remain faithful to their leader in his struggle for the holy canons. St. Aldhelm ruled his diocese for another 4 years. He preached day and night, travelling ceaselessly. At Sherborne, he built a fine cathedral, and he continued to administer his monasteries at Malmesbury, Bradford-on-Avon, and Frome. Once, while he was preaching in a village, he fixed his ashen staff into the ground. It grew miraculously and put forth boughs and leaves. The bishop was concentrating on his sermon and did not notice the miracle. But when the people drew his attention to it, he gave glory to God and left an offering there. Later, many other ash trees sprang from this original, to the extent that the village was called Bishop Trees, now Stoke Orchard in Gloucestershire. On May 26, 709, Aldhelm reposed in the wooden church of the village of Dolting in Somerset. Some years later, while a stone church was being consecrated on the spot, a blind widow pushed her way to the altar and was healed through the intercession of the saint, who had always been merciful to widows in his lifetime. Many more healings were done through washing in water that had touched the stone on which the saint had died. At the moment that St. Aldhelm reposed, he appeared in a vision to his friend, St. Egwin, Bishop of Worcester, and commanded him to go at once to Dolting. Egwin immediately rode the 80 to 100 miles to the body of the saint, and after celebrating a funeral liturgy, arranged for it to be transported to Malmesbury. At every 7 miles of the 50-mile journey, the procession stopped, and crosses, later known as bishop stones, were erected at Egwin's command. All of these crosses, including one in the monastery of Malmesbury, were still standing in good condition in the 12th century, and miracles continued to be wrought there for centuries. On reaching Malmesbury, St. Egwin buried the body of his friend in the church of St. Michael. In 855, King Ethelwulf of Wessex, father of St. Alfred the Great, exhumed the body of St. Aldhelm and transferred it into a magnificent shrine adorned with silver and showing representations of the saint's miracles. Another great benefactor of the church was King Athelstan, who had been delivered from danger at the Battle of Brunanburg through the prayers of St. Aldhelm. On May 5, 986, St. Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, transferred St. Aldhelm's relics for safety's sake into a stone tomb on the right of the altar. But during the reign of King Ethelred II, the pagan Danes broke into the monastery and came up to the shrine. One of them seized it and was about to cut out the precious stones when he was struck down, as if stabbed. The rest fled in terror. Once a very beautiful woman named Elfildis became the captive of a Norwegian count who wanted to divorce his wife and marry her. In the end, he raped her, but he died soon thereafter. The future King Martyr Olaf of Norway, hearing of her beauty, made advances to her as well. Although Elfildis rejected these advances, he too raped her, and as a result, in 1024, a son was born to her named Magnus. When St. Olaf was killed in 1030, Magnus was proclaimed king, but died only 18 months later. Then the unfortunate Elfildis returned to England, promising God that if she returned safely, she would never again eat meat. Some years later, however, she was at a banquet and was persuaded to break her vow. As a result, she was struck with paralysis. For 3 years, she visited the shrines of the saints, seeking healing. At length, coming to St. Aldhelm's shrine on his feast day, she was restored to full health. She then became a nun and was buried at Malmesbury. St. Aldhelm's resting place attracted pious Christians even from the east. Thus, early in the 11th century, a monk named Constantine came to Malmesbury from Greece. It was not known why he had left his homeland. He planted the first vineyard in the monastery, which survived for many years. He was of a very mild disposition and very abstinent habits. When he was on the point of death, he drew an archbishop's pallium out of the knapsack that he always carried with him, put it on, and immediately died. He was buried in the church of St. Andrew. But after some years, some building works in the monastery necessitated the exhumation of his body. The bones were found to be of exceptional whiteness and exuded a beautiful fragrance. Once, a dangerous demoniac was bound with cords and carried to Malmesbury on the eve of the Feast of the Ascension. The monks advised those who were carrying him to pray to St. Aldhelm on his behalf. He was laid before the altar, and after calming down and falling into a light sleep, rose completely healed. At another time, a cripple seeking a cure stopped at Malmesbury on his way to Christchurch in Hampshire. Immediately as he entered the church, he felt a kind of current passing through all his members. After falling asleep in front of the altar, he was woken up by the chanting of the monks coming into the church and leapt up cured. Once, after the Norman Papist conquest of England, a fisherman from the Isle of Wight was struck blind while fishing at sea. His boat was brought to land by his companions, who advised him to seek the help of God. They rowed him to Christchurch, where he remained for 3 years. He was then told in a dream to go to Malmesbury, where he recovered his sight. This miracle convinced the Normans, who were in general skeptical about the holiness of the Saxon saints, and whose first archbishop, Lanfranc, had discontinued the veneration of Aldhelm, that Aldhelm was indeed a saint, and Osmond, Bishop of Salisbury, authorized the resumption of his veneration and the translation of his relics. Then Abbot Warren brought out the relics, which had been hidden for fear of the Danes, and after a 3-day fast, the bishop translated them into the shrine on October 3rd, 1078. Many more miracles continued to be performed at the shrine of St. Aldhelm, as related in detail by William of Malmesbury in 1125. The Orthodox Church celebrates the memory of St. Aldhelm of Sherborne on May 25th. Holy Bishop Aldhelm, pray to God for us.